Parris Mayhew, welcome to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propagandhi.
Thank you, Greg. I'm happy to be here. I'm always happy to acknowledge um, such a cool cover that Propagandhi did of my song, one of the first songs I ever wrote. And all these years later, it's pretty astonishing.
Very cool. Well, Parris, you have a diverse career in entertainment in general. I'm wondering if you can just tell the listeners a little bit about what you've done, kind of just a little bit of a potted bio to introduce you to the listeners.
Um, I'm an artist. I never really embraced that until later in life. Oddly enough, I trained in art school. I went to the High School of Art and Design. I went to the School of Visual Arts. So I spent 9 years in art school. And all during those years, I never even considered myself an artist. And as I entered college, I'd already started to try to start a band. I had a band like in early high school, and then that fell apart when I started veering into a different musical direction. I wasn't My first band was kind of like Rush, and we wanted to be like Rush, and then suddenly I heard Motorhead and the Sex Pistols, and all of a sudden my music changed, and the other guys in the band didn't really get it. So I kind of went off in another direction. I tried to get in one of the current bands that was happening, but they wouldn't let me write songs. So I decided I had to start my own band if I was going to play my own music. And, and then that band ended up being the Cro-Mags. And, and even though I had, a marked career in the Cro-Mags, I'm just, a creative person. And when I decided to leave the Cro-Mags, I got into the film business. It actually happened parallel because I made the We Gotta Know video for the Cro-Mags, and that got me some attention and from filmmakers like Paul Rackman, the guy who began the Slam Dance Film Festival. He was a young director in the city, and he enlisted me. He initially wanted to produce and have me direct, and then I kind of like wanted to be a director of photography, so I pushed him to direct and me to shoot, and we did a few things together. I became a director and directed Onyx Slam, which was the longest
Hmm.
running #1 video on MTV ever, and other definitive music videos like Typo Negative's Black #1 and
Yeah.
Biohazard's Punishment, Shades of Grey, Tales from the Hard Side. I did 5 videos for them, which kind of defined their early career, and many others. And then I got back into music again. And, I'm lured by my passions and opportunities, and I had an opportunity to get a major label record deal with Polygram, and that's when we went back and made the Revenge album. But when that kind of all fizzled out for the same reasons it did the first time, I went back into the film business as a camera operator, and here's one of the tools of my trade,
Yeah.
called Trinity. It's a kind of a steady cam. And I'm a camera operator on television and movies here in New York, which is primarily where everything is shot. Done a couple of seasons of Blue Bloods, a couple of seasons of The Americans, a couple of seasons of Evil. I've worked on basically every TV show in New York.
Nice.
And, and that's what I do as a day job. And recently, after being in the film business for almost 20 years without basically even really hinting at the fact that I was a musician, I recorded an album and released it under the brand the Aggros, which is now my brand, not necessarily my band, since I'm pretty much the central musical force in the band. And yeah, that's what I'm doing now. And I guess that's almost everything. It's kind of like a overview.
Well, I love The Americans as well. I didn't know you worked on that show. I was looking at your IMDb bio earlier, and I was like, man, this is so cool. And then I went and watched your Typo Negative video earlier today as well. So I've just been having a blast, kind of exploring your output over the years since I've been, preparing for this and thinking about this conversation we were going to have. And you are a founding member of Cro-Mags. Um, and I just want to say off the top that if anybody wants to hear your entire story in relation to Cro-Mags and the records that you made and the story of the band, your conversation on the Hard Lore podcast episode which is like 2.5 hours long, is so comprehensive that I think that everybody should go and listen to that as well because it was so good. It was like such a saga, you know? Um, so, just as a basic overview, with that said, tell listeners a little bit about the years you were involved and the records that you played on, but maybe also a little bit about the records that you have material on but don't appear on.
I mean, it's people obviously have their point of view, but when I left my high school band and then tried to join this band called the Mad and got this basic hard lesson that after I learned all their songs and spent like a month and a half learning their songs to play a gig, and then I tried to introduce a song that I'd just written, which ended up being called World Peace. And it was actually called World Peace at the time because the singer of my band reported missing the high school band. When he heard it, he was like, "Oh my God, it just sounds like the world is saying world peace can't be done." And that remained the title. I loved what he said so much that, even though it didn't, it was probably a year or two until anybody else besides the guys in the Mad heard it. And when I introduced it, as when I what it's always been all the whole story. It can be flipped on so many sides of point of view. Harley has painted this picture that he had this plan, to start the Cro-Mags, and he made this demo, which is, none of it's true. When I met him, there was no mention of the name Cro-Mags. I knew that he had once tried to start a band that had failed, and they played one gig, and I actually went to that gig with him, but they
Hmm.
didn't even play as Cro-Mags. They played a Disco Smoothie, and you know, I, and none of the songs that band played ever became Cro-Mag songs.
Hmm.
So this idea that there was this premise before I came along, and the demos and the sound and the blueprint, it's just not the truth.
Hmm.
What is actually the truth is I had spent about a year after not playing with the Mad, wanting to start my own band, and in the first stages of that was putting out a flyer. And back then, we didn't have Craigslist or internet. You just walk down the street. You would just walk down Avenue A, and you knew everybody on the hardcore scene anyway. So it was just kind of like I was just putting up a flyer, doing what I had to do. I went to Bleecker Bob's. I went to, and I went down to 171A, and I had my tape, and I was like taping this flyer up on the wall. And that's when I met, even though I had, known who Harley was because I liked the Stimulators and I'd seen him many times and I'd talked to him before, but he always acted like he didn't know anybody. And but he was with a friend of mine, and so he looked at my flyer and he basically dismissed it, like whatever. But my friend Paul was very insistent, that I was like somebody to be reckoned with on my instrument, which was the bass at the time. And he just kind of like pretended like he wasn't listening, and then finally agreed that we would hear each other play. So, but he made it all out to be like it was an audition, even though he was basically answering my ad. And but the long and short of it is that when we first started playing together, he was in like five, not five, maybe three or four other bands. He was anybody he ran into, he would try to start a band. Because I guess, after he came out of the Stimulators, he had told everybody, "I'm going to start this band. I'm going to start this band." And but I guess he didn't have anything to back it up. He was basically just hanging on a street corner, huffing glue,
Hmm.
and talking about it, but nothing was really happening. So when he met me, I had this like stockpile of songs. It wasn't a lot. Maybe it was 4 or 5 songs. It was World Peace, Life of My Own, It's the Limit, um, all basically fully realized songs. And we would jam together, privately. And but he was still off playing with. He had a band with John Joseph and Doug called MOI, and he was playing in Murphy's Law, and he would basically play with anybody. And again, there was never any premise that it was going to be called Cro-Mags, and I was never presented with this demo of these are the songs that we're going to play. This is the band, this is the blueprint. That's all fiction. He actually didn't even record that demo until after we had been writing songs, or he'd been learning my songs for almost a year, probably more. It's hard for me to judge back then. I mean, I'd have to go back over the dates, but you know, when I went to that Disco Smoothie, that show that he claimed to be, the first Cro-Mags, and so we were like, I'd say 1980, late 1980, and basically, looking back, it's a lot clearer to me than it was at the time because there was so much gaslighting and like trying to be controlled over this thing, and it was basically me just sitting in a room showing this guy that I'd met who I kind of was like, this is great because he's in a band that everybody knows. To me, seemed like an opportunity to get my music listened to, but it wasn't like we were playing any of his songs. In the beginning, we only played my songs.
Hmm.
And he had these other bands, and like they all started going by the wayside, and my stockpile of songs began started getting bigger. And then suddenly, he was like more all in with what I was doing, and it was like he basically just joined my band when all these other bands didn't work out. And then later on superimposed this supposed plan over the music that I had already made. So in a sense, I mean, I'm painting that picture to show you that, like I played on Age of Quarrel, but I
Yeah.
didn't just play on Age of Quarrel. I wrote Age of Quarrel. That was my first album that I had been gearing up to make before I met Harley. Even when I made that flyer, putting it up, when I went to his aunt Denise's house and played him the first couple of songs that he had ever heard. World Peace. I walked into a room, sat down, and played World Peace. He was probably like, "Holy shit, this is it." And he did. He said that him and Denise were having conversation about me, because she knew that he was trying to do all these other, trying to get something together, but nothing was coming together. And there I was, I was like picture perfect for him to superimpose this mission on. But and so we made Age of Quarrel, and we made and then the band fell apart, and then we regrouped and made Best Wishes, and then um, floundered around. And again, everybody was gone. And then we tried to recrew the band, and we did, and we recruited with this young guitarist named Rob Buckley, and he was like 17 years old, which wasn't that unusual at the time because when we started, I was like 16,
Yeah.
and Harley was, or maybe even been 15. And Harley was like 13 or 14, or I can't remember. And Rob was 17. And we were like, didn't, the hardcore scene was very age fluid. You know, there was Uncle Al from Murphy's Law who was like in his 30s, or I'm only guessing that now. God, I was 15 years old. To me, somebody who was 25 seemed like an adult. But and then there was people like Steve Poss, and then like even when Freddie Madball was brought around by his brother, that wasn't like that unusual. I mean, there was it was like going to a school when you went to
Hmm.
CBGBs. There were kids of all ages and stuff like that. So when Rob joined the band, it wasn't that big thing. But he was like similar to me when the Cro-Mags first started. He had this like stockpile of songs or riffs, and we got him in the band, and me and him just sat in a room for like a whole winter and a summer and wrote the entire third Cro-Mags album, which was called Alpha Mega, that neither of us played on.
Mm.
Those songs were all stolen from us.
Yeah.
So even though I didn't even play on that third album, that album wouldn't exist if it wasn't for me and Rob. And then years later, uh, we made the Revenge album on Polygram,
Hmm.
and that was my last foray into that band. And I remember like being in the studio when we were making that record because it was like there was had been a whole bunch of years where I wasn't a Cro-Mag, and so I'd written a bunch of stuff, and it was the same kind of thing. I had like this little catalog of songs that I walked in with. I mean, I wrote 90% of the Revenge album, and I'd written it years before. It was just stuff that I'd written casually for my own pleasure in my apartment in Brooklyn on the bass because that's all I had at the time. I had this G&L bass. So that was my imprint on the Cro-Mags. Harley always says, "I'm the only one who ever played on every Cro-Mags album." I was like, "Yeah, but I'm the only one who's only played on the good ones."
Yeah, nice. Well, this is why I wanted you here, Paris, on this episode because I love your stories and you go into so much more depth about each one of those records on that hard lore episode that I mentioned earlier. So Definitely, everybody, listeners, go check that out because it's so good. Okay, so let's talk about Hard Times. Propagandhi covers Hard Times on it's on this album right here. It's called Return of the Red Menace, which is a benefit album for AK Press. It came out in the late 90s, and Propagandhi's version is sung by Todd Kowalski, their bass player, who is a massive Cro-Mags fan, by the way. And Todd wanted me to ask you if you remember the 1986 Cro-Mags show at Wellington's in Winnipeg, Manitoba, with I think it was the GBH tour.
Absolutely. I remember all those shows. I was like the guy in the band that didn't smoke crack or huff glue. So my memory is very much intact. Uh, and that time was, it's etched in my memory because, even though the Cro-Mags has this like enduring legacy, the actual maybe now it's different because Harley and John have both kind of did their like, franchise versions for long periods of time, just playing gigs to play gigs, and John played quite consistently for a long time, and Harley plays quite consistently now, in a much smaller level than we did back then. But when we played, it was a big deal. And, we put out Age of Quarrel, and we probably only toured for 4 months, maybe
Mm,
five. We did the States with GBH, which was probably a month, and we did Motorhead, which was about a month, and we did Europe twice, I think, and both of them were like a month. So like 5 months, 6 months tops for the entire promotion of Age of Quarrel, which is
wow.
astonishing, kind of. And then the same thing with Best Wishes. When we retooled and did Best Wishes, we went on tour. We did the United States for like a month or two and did Europe. And then it was almost the same pattern. Like we went back to Europe and we broke up. Like you know, it just, if you add up all the time that we spent on the road, it was less than a year
Mm,
when I was in the band. Uh, and I hate even being forced to use that expression when I was in the band. That band was my band. I started the band. I wrote the songs, and then I was so annoyed, and the person that I was working with was so terrible that I sacrificed my own music just to get away from him.
yeah. Well, let's chat about Hard Times, the song. I want to hear the story of the song Hard Times. Uh, like, take me all the way back to the beginning, your earliest memories of the song being written, and then we'll go through a little bit about the origin of the title, the authorship of the lyrics. I want the whole entire story of Hard Times.
I mean, it's very easy to remember because it was also, besides that high school band that I had, it was, which the music I wrote in that band was just kind of like, I don't remember writing that music, oddly enough. Um, it was, I guess it was different because I was trying to be something. I was trying to be Rush, and I was just doing my best to imitate them. I mean, that's what young musicians do anyway. They look to some kind of role model, and they look at what they've done, and they try to formulate what the plan was. Songwriting is not that complicated, but when you're a young teenager, it seems very complicated. It seems mystical, magical, and you don't realize that it's just kind of methodical. Um, in terms of its structure, I think there are obviously people like Bob Dylan who make it into magic, or any number of artists. I don't know why I thought of Bob Dylan, but when I was writing the songs for the my new band, I kind of was on a mission. Like it was a completely different way of approaching. Like I would go home from school every day after school and just pick up my bass because I was the bass player at the time, and I would just do my best to like do what Lemmy did, which was like everybody knows who Lemmy is now, but nobody knew who Lemmy was then. I discovered Motorhead completely by accident. This kid who was the singer of my band, Reported Missing, got a hold of a record and we started listening to it, and it just flipped my perspective on its ass. No longer had to be Yes to make records. You could be somebody like Lemmy or somebody like Steve Jones, from the Sex Pistols. And so I was just like attacking it with this fervor of like brute force as opposed to skill. And I was writing all this stuff. And like I said, I had a whole bunch of Life of My Own, It's the Limit, all these things had been written before. Um, uh, I actually found somebody who appreciated what I was doing, which was Harley. He appreciated it because he could use it. um, I misinterpreted his enthusiasm for what I was doing as being like, we're in it together. This is great. We're going to do something great. He just saw it as something he could like use. But but we had already basically hashed out almost everything that I had started with, and it had become this thing where like I literally went home every day to try to figure out how to write something else that would make Harley's eyes light up. It became this challenge to like keep to maintain that enthusiasm that I'd gotten from this guy that everybody already knew, you know, and so that's what I did. I literally like it was like nose to the grindstone. Every day I would go home and play, and I would, and then I would like go somewhere. Or he would come to my house. He often met me out in front of my school, not wearing a shirt, and he'd come back to my apartment, and we would, I would show him what I had just written, and it was like all this enthusiasm, but and we had just started to like try to bring people in. I think we had tried this drummer named because Harley was the drummer, I was the bass player, and then we there was this guy who managed the Bad Brains, and he wanted to come in. He just basically he really seemed to want to manage us, but he was figuring what the hell, he'd give it a shot, and we went in and jammed with him on drums, but he wasn't very skilled. And then then slowly like Harley began to introduce this kind of parade of knuckleheads, because he wanted to like have a skinhead band. He wanted, so if somebody showed up with a skinhead who had an instrument, didn't really matter how good they were considered. And we had gone through this Kid Heap, and then, but that fell apart for weird reasons. And then right about the time when I had written the riff for Hard Times, um, there was this Harley just started showing up with this kid named Steve Psycho. Everybody back then had a nickname. He was Steve Psycho. But like, it was funny almost immediately. Like me and my friends, like one of my close friends at the time was Sean Taggart, the artist who did like all the album covers for Agnostic Front, Crumbsuckers, Prong, the Jerky Boys. But we were in high school together. We went to the High School of Art and Design together. And he immediately started calling Steve Stupid instead of Steve Psycho. Because he was like, just like a moron. And and then Harley was hanging out with him all the time because he was a skinhead, and anybody who showed up and wanted to be a skinhead suddenly like fell into the ranks behind Harley as Harley walked around. And then Harley mentioned to me, oh, Steve plays bass and he's going to be in the band. And I was like, oh boy, we had just gone through this with this other kid. And ultimately I always felt like the music would win out. So I always just kind of like, okay, whatever. So we went to a rehearsal studio. Harley played drums. I jumped on guitar, and this guy, Steve Stupid, played bass. And that day when we went in, Steve already kind of knew World Peace and Life of My Own. It's like Harley had prepped him, showed him these songs. But I always like when I try somebody new to show them like something right out new. And I just written the riff to Hard Times, the first one, the band, and we jammed on that. And I'd written it the day before, and it was
Hmm.
one of those. It was also one of those things, where I described earlier, where I'm trying to formulate this way of writing songs, and I'd already written Life of My Own, and that's just basically one riff. It's like this open E string with this punching of three chords, which dun 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 dun, and see it's fast and slow. So I mean, amazing one a riff with I mean a song with only one riff. But ultimately, I know that when I wrote that one, I was thinking about how what hardcore or even the bands around me that I liked were doing. And there was a band called Frontline, and they had this one song which I don't even know the name of because they never really made a record, but it was this chugging on one note and then going It's like three chord punch after a ride on the thing, which was also what the Bad Brains did in Riot Squad. Even though
Mm.
Riot Squad wasn't out on a record yet, but I'd seen the Bad Brains so many times, I knew all their songs inside and out. But it was this thing of like just that whole structure of just riding on a note and then hitting three notes was Life of My Own was a little different because it goes dun 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 dun. But when you're like trying to formulate something, to me it made sense that they were similar in
Hmm.
in form. So I was like, okay, I did that. I'll do it again. And I tried to do another one with that form. There was another Black Flag thing, like in the song, what's that song? I think it's "Gimme, Gimme, Gimme," and there were a couple of I think X also had a song that went down. So I would just sit in my room and play, that rhythm with different chords, trying to figure out how to make a song. I never did one with the Black Flag song, but that's how the riff of Hard Times came along because the Bad Brains riff and the frontline riff went. So mine went. The only thing I
Oh
changed
yeah.
came to a snappy stop, and so I just played that over and over, and I brought it in that day, and I showed it to Steve, and we played it and just since it was just that one riff, we practiced the stops and then starting up again. And when you're enthusiastic about something that sounds good, we were like, yeah, this sounds great, this sounds great. And after we had jammed it for about an hour, Harley like leans over the drums, he's like, oh yeah, man, this is great, I'm so glad you remembered that. And I was like, remembered what? He goes, you know, remember last week when we went to the movies? We went to Times Square and we saw the movie POW with Chuck Norris. We rode up there on the subway. And I was like, yeah. He goes, well, when we were on the train, I hummed this to you. I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And he goes, yeah. And he turns to Steve, and Steve starts rolling his eyes at me like, who the fuck does this kid think he is? Taking credit for Harley's song. Like after I just showed them both how to play it, I mean, that was the kind of gaslighting that was going on, but it really just started there with that. And 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 it became this big argument and it got nasty. But basically the two of them kind of got together and were like, oh, this guy. And then they left. And then later on that night, when I went back out after I dropped my guitar off, Harley was like, so what'd you think of Steve? I thought it sounded really good. And then I was like, well, the song sounded good. And it's so funny because I even remember catching myself saying the song. He had already gotten me referring to the song as the song and not my song,
Hmm.
which was like what he did. It was just like this way of trying to manipulate so you wouldn't have to get into a conflict. Just agree to say it a different way to make it implied that anything that he said in the studio earlier about being on the subway and humming the song to him was true. So that's of course why my memory of that song is so crystal clear because it was kind of this weird beginning of like a nastiness
Mm.
it went from like just embracing my songs in private to new people being in the room and realizing that the reason why he had taken Steve off alone to show him my songs was to give Steve the impression that he wrote my songs. And then
Yeah.
there we were in the studio, and I was presenting a different image. I was presenting the guy who came in with the riffs and showing them. So he had to immediately nip that in the bud and show this prospect that he was really the boss and not me. So that's how the main riff uh, came about. And the irony of it is about a week later there was a matinee at CBGB's, and Steve had spent this whole week like walking around with his chest out, like I'm in this band now. Me and Harley are in this band now, and he would just you know, cock of the walk up and down Avenue A, and then one of the things that Harley would do is he didn't like anybody else who got attention. There was this like posse from Queens, and like kind of like the main figure in this posse was this kid Ditto, and Harley was like very verbally expressing about how much he didn't like Ditto. So Steve took it upon himself to like mouth off to Ditto. And Ditto, ever since, has become a very um, renowned film director. His name is Ditto Montiel. But the thing that marked Ditto's presence back then, which I guess which bothered Harley because Harley like presented himself as like a tough guy, even though he was like 15 years old. And but Ditto was like bigger than all of us. He was like a jock, like from the
Mm.
football team or something. And and I just remember like I'm standing there with Sean Taggart and Harley and Steve Stupid were standing together, and Ditto and his boys were like standing on the sidewalk. You know, everybody was just standing outside of CBGB's, and then Steve just started like mouthing off to Ditto, like just saying shit like from across the sidewalk. And then and Ditto said something back to him, and like they kind of like met in the middle of the sidewalk, and then then Ditto threw a beating on Steve that I'd never seen anything like it in my life. I mean, I've never seen anybody beaten that badly. I mean, this wasn't like a kid fight. This was like one man destroying another man, and it was so bad that Steve was like trying to crawl away under this van that was parked right in front of CB's, like one of the band's vans, and he was like, he got his head and his shoulders underneath the van, like the whole time Ditto was kicking him, like in the face and in the ribs, and like just, I mean, it was brutal. And then Ditto grabs him by the ankles and like drags him out from underneath the van and just starts kicking him again until the dude is like just destroyed, like unrecognizable face, blood, swollen, and and me and Sean and me and Harley's just standing there watching the whole thing. And me and Sean Taggart and my friends were like off in our little, like looking at it, and all I'm thinking to myself is, thank God,
Mm.
we don't have Steve Stupid in the band anymore. But anyway, Steve finally got himself onto his feet, which took a while. And Harley was like 15 feet away, and then Steve kind of like turned and saw Harley and started walking towards him, and then Harley just turned his back on him, and he was like, Harley, and Harley just like was like, nah, man. And then Steve walked off down the sidewalk, never to be seen again.
Wow.
And that's irrevocably linked to the song as well
Yeah.
in my mind, because these little things that happen that mark time, that was a very dramatic one. And and it also, that whole experience made me realize that I can't count on Ditto to beat up everybody that comes along that's going to be in the band. So I had to come up with something else, and that option was, you know, realizing that I knew the drummer of Frontline, this band that had kind of like popped up and was suddenly making a little bit of noise. The drummer I knew from skateboarding. There, in Manhattan, there were like all these little skate spots. Not a lot of them, but there were two major ones. There was the East Side ramps and the West Side ramps. And I lived on the East Side, so I rode the East Side ramps. Me and my friends built them and skated them. And then in Riverside Park, there was this other bunch of ramp. There was this ramp. There were always ramps there that were built in the park. And Mackie was part of that crew. And it was kind of just like what is in California, like locals only. You don't go to other people's skate spots. But I would go over there and just brave it. And I was such a maniac skater. I think that they let me skate it even though I wasn't a local,
Hmm.
just because I was just so I would just go for the craziest shit. And I got to know Mackie there as well as you can know Mackie. Mackie's a very low key guy, and we were young teenagers, and everybody's very guarded, and people don't even know who they are yet. But Mackie was
Yeah.
quiet, and he was, and we're all street kids, and all street kids are like, "What are you looking at?" There was no like, "Hey, oh, it's great, you're a skater, come over here." It's not like
Yeah.
like kids hug, like I see kids at the skateboard park, they all meet and they hug and they kiss, and it's all very nice. Nah, wasn't like that at all. It was very hard. You could get a skateboard across the face for skating somebody else's ramp, but that's where I got to know Mackie, and I actually saw him play at kind of it wasn't really a block party, but it was an outdoor thing on the like in Harlem, like on Broadway. I remember they were set up in the median on Broadway. If you know New York, like Broadway is a two-way street, and in the middle there's a median with like a kind of a garden and sidewalks. And I remember Mackie was set up playing the drums, and there was like a bass player and a guitar player. And I remember being like, "Ah, this guy's so great." And then I saw him play with Frontline, and I realized that it was like I have to get somebody. Besides the fact that he was the only musician of note on the scene, uh, I thought of outside of me and Harley was I had to start enlisting people myself, or I was going to be surrounded by more Steve Stupids.
Hmm.
So that's when I made the move to get Mackie. And Mackie wasn't an easy sell, but he came into the band, and then very soon after that, Eric Casanova came into the band. He was our original singer. And,
Hmm.
again, Eric was probably 14 or 15 at the time, and he had almost no musical experience. I mean, I hate to say that because he was in another band before that. He was in the Young and the Useless with Adam Horovitz from the Beastie Boys.
Oh, cool.
And but they were like literally all a bunch of little kids, and they played covers like "Rise and Shine" and "Give God Your Glory, Glory," but hardcore "Rise and Shine,
Yeah.
God Your Glory, 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 Glory." And they were fun because they had personality. Skilkin and Adam Horovitz, they all, they had personality. There's no wonder why Adam Horovitz became, a pop icon. But so Eric was in that band, but he really wasn't a drummer. He never owned a drum set. I think he got a set of sticks and he pounded along with them. So, but he was like another one of these kids that Harley enlisted to fall in the ranks and follow him around. And he was great. Eric was a great, amazing, dynamic, wild, funny kid. He had a lot of personality. He was very cool. I liked him a lot, and that's testament to the fact that he was a couple of years younger than me as a teenager, which usually is a vast divide, but it wasn't. We were all friends. We hung out on the street, so it invariably and inevitably became brought up that Eric should be our singer. And of course, the question always is, can he sing? Because nobody had ever heard him sing. But that really somehow didn't really come into it. Um, and Eric just started coming to rehearsals with us and listening to the music. And he didn't, again, like, I premised that by saying he was in a band before, but he wasn't really a musician. So it wasn't like he had been writing lyrics for a long time, fancied himself a singer, had the ambitions of being a singer, and it just had never come about yet. This was just suddenly thrust upon him by Harley. You're going to be the singer. So he was like, okay, what do I do? So he took his school notebook,
Yeah.
little black and white school notebook that everybody had, and he did what I did. He looked around and he said, well, I said the Bad Brains do this, three punches. Okay, that works. Just change the chords and you got a song. Or the same thing I do with World Peace. I listened to Ace of Spades over and over and over again, and I was like, okay, you ride on the E string and you add a couple of notes, but I'll add some Rush notes instead of, okay, that works, that's a song. So Eric basically, I'm not putting myself, I'm putting myself in Eric's head, guessing what he did, but I saw it happening. At the time, there were popular songs, and one of them was Street Justice. It was a hip hop song. It goes, Street Justice coming to your town. And it even had like Street Justice background vocals on it, but it was a hip hop song and it was on the radio. So Eric
Yeah.
took his little notebook and he wrote at the top of the page, Street Justice, right? Because that's like, okay, that's the song title that works. But then he wrote his own song underneath it. But he got that title from the radio. Flip the page over. Oh, what else does he like? He likes Bob Marley, Survival, the Survival album. So he writes Survival of the Streets on the top. And then he writes his own song. And then Run DMC comes out with Hard Times.
Mm.
So he turns the page and he writes Hard Times at the top of the page. And then he writes his own song. And we went into the studio and we started jamming it. And at that point, we had World Peace, which Harley had written the lyrics to my song. We had Life of My Own, which was my music, and Eric wrote the lyrics. It's only basically one line. You come into this world with nothing except yourself. You know, he was a little kid.
Yeah.
It was very simple, but it was perfect and great. The guy had a talent. You know, I mean, I've often said you take Survival of the Streets, Hard Times, Life of My Own. You take those early songs that Eric wrote, and that's the Cro-Mags manifesto.
Hmm.
And that's exactly how the lyrics to Hard Times came about. And we hadn't even been rehearsing that much. We were rehearsing probably once a week for a couple of months, and almost immediately I was like, oh my God, we have to play. So I went down to CBGB's, and I booked the first gig. I told the story on one of these podcasts. I don't have to tell the whole
Yeah.
story, but I ended up going down there and just booking a show. And then Eric disappeared. Like, he didn't have a phone. His family didn't have a phone. He lived somewhere out in Queens. I'd never been there. I lived in Manhattan. I grew up in Manhattan. And if you lived in Manhattan in the 70s and the 80s, you didn't go to Queens. Like, there was no reason
Yeah.
to go to Queens. I think I'd only been to Queens a handful of times in my life. And I lived in New York City. I went to Yankee Stadium. I mean, I went to Shea Stadium a couple of times. Yankee Stadium's in the Bronx. I went to Shea Stadium. I saw the Police there, and I saw maybe one baseball game because I'm not a baseball fan. But there was no reason to go out there. So, and everybody always just kind of showed up, all of us. It wasn't like, again, I'm trying to reference what the scene was like. And the scene was like every day.
Yeah.
It was after school, we went down, we met all the kids. It wasn't like we met all these kids at a show once a week or once a month. And most of the people being random, and you knew a few people. All the kids you hung out every day went to the show. So when you went to the show, it was the same kids you were hanging out on the street with. And then when the show was over, everybody didn't go home. We all went someplace else together. We went to a street corner or the park or a bar, that kind of thing. So the fact that we hadn't seen Eric in a while was like, this is really weird. But, also when you're a kid, you think he's going to show up tomorrow
Yeah.
and you don't get really nervous. And then all of a sudden, Eric was a ghost, and the show was coming up, and we were just like, "Holy shit, what are we gonna do?" Um, maybe hopefully he'll see the ad in the paper because it said Cro-Mags, because by that time we had taken on the name Cro-Mags, uh, and and so we're all at CBGB's. Like, I have my amp and my guitar, and we're all nervously waiting. What are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? And then when we see Eric bopping down the street, and we're like, oh, I saw him. I was like, oh, did you see the ad in the paper? He was like, ad in the paper? And I go, yeah, we're playing today. He goes, what? And he goes, and it'd been like over a month since we had done that like little marathon of him like reading his lyrics out of his notebook and stuff like that. So me and him just basically went to the corner and I hummed the songs and I pounded out the beats on the top of a car and he sang along trying to refresh his memory and got it as close as we could, and then we went up and played and it was nobody knew, but Eric was forgetting the lyrics and Harley was kicking him like for not remembering the lyrics, which all things considered, it wasn't his fault. He didn't know, but that wasn't enough for him. And the show went off well. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things that I always noted about it was you could see the people in the audience. You could see the looks on their faces. They had that look like, oh my God, what's this?
Yeah.
And a look that didn't happen when John Harley and Doug's MOI played at CBGB's. They played a couple of gigs, and then when they disappeared, nobody really noticed. But this was different. And
Hmm.
so I booked another gig as soon as I could, and we played another gig, one more gig with Eric, and then that was the end of it with Eric. But in that little brief span, that little window that Eric was in the band, he wrote Hard Times. That song
Yeah.
that like Machine Head and Propagandhi and COC and SOD and Mr. Bungle, and all these bands have honored us by adding to their live repertoire. I mean, you could play anything, any song, thousands and thousands of Led Zeppelin, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, everything, all the bands out there, and they chose that. That's amazing to me. And I must mention this before I forget. I thought it was, I think it's hysterical the way they did Propag instead of
Oh
Cro.
yeah.
Like the first time I heard, I was like, "What did he say? What's that?" And I had to think about it for a long time. I was like, "I don't get it." It was like prop, and then Gandhi. No, oh, I get it. That's funny.
Yeah.
But I
Man.
also want to comment that, like, of all those covers, the Propagandhi one is the most true to the way I wrote it and the way Eric wrote it, but ultimately also the way John sang it. Because you know John is the voice, uh,
Hmm.
despite the fact that Eric wrote it. It's there's a lot of that in music, but you can't take away nostalgia and memory. People can't listen to The Age of Quarrel and say, "Oh, but Eric wrote it." It would have been nice if Eric had been credited,
Hmm.
but he wasn't, and that was treacherous and lame. But John is the voice of it, and the Propagandhi cover is true to the way John sang it, which was written by Eric, even the cadence, and and true to the way I wrote the riffs and the way we performed it. It just, almost when you listen to it, you have to, like, bend your ear, like, wow, it sounds like it's us. And I think that's great. And I think it's cool. And of all the covers, Machine Head and SOD and all the ones I've ever heard, I think the Propagandhi one is the superior one.
Yes. Nice. So the way it's on the record, is it like word for word what Eric wrote? Were there any lyrical revisions or anything like that? Do you remember?
No,
It's identical.
it's identical.
Amazing. Um, cool. Did you get to see any like live videos of Propaganda playing their version live, like on YouTube at all?
I did. I saw a couple. When I first heard about it years ago, even when YouTube was so new, like I didn't become YouTube really savvy until many years later. But I did go and watch all the covers. Every time I heard of a different cover, I would check them out, and generally disappointed. Not because they're bad. Like Lamb of God did one, and um, it's so capable.
Mm,
It's like these guys are incredible players and musicians, and but there's just it was almost, it was too capable, or something, I don't know, or people can't help but put their own stamp on it. I mean, that's one of the things I always appreciate about Dave Lombardo when he played in the Misfits. He didn't try to Slayerify Misfits
right.
and make it like,
Yeah.
I want your skull.
Right.
He played it the way he was supposed to play it. He played it like a pro. Maybe he played it a little better, but he played it exactly the same. And I think that's what I think that was the difference between something like Lamb of God. Like Lamb of God is, stellar band, and I'm and when I heard the cover that they did of ours, I was kind of astonished. I was like, wow, they're doing it better than us. Maybe that's why I feel that way. But 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 it doesn't feel hardcore. It feels metal. Maybe that's what maybe that's my gripe. And
Yeah.
and the guy in SOD, uh, Billy Milano's thing, it was also very true to it. And Machine Head, when they did it, it was, kind of a more metal version, but they did it at Dynamo in front of a big crowd, and Bobby the Handball jumping around in the background was very exciting. It's always good to see that kind of stuff. But Propagandhi is version is still head and shoulders my favorite of any Cro-Mags cover I've ever heard.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's incredible. What a cool anecdote. Side note, were you at the Misfits Madison Square Garden show in 2019?
I was.
I was there too. I flew down from Buffalo and stayed in the East Village, and I went to that show. Not a bad song the whole entire night. The Damned, Rancid, Misfits. It was a perfect night of music.
I've seen it. I'm a New Yorker. I've seen a lot of shows at the Garden, And there are bands that belong on that stage and there are bands that don't. I mean, I remember, I mean, I saw a lot of the early epic mega bands like Rush and Yes and Police and all that stuff. And all those bands obviously belong on stage at Madison Square Garden. But, you know, as time went on, it seemed like a lot of bands came to prominence that weren't stadium bands. I think maybe it was when I first saw Lionel Richie on stage at Madison Square Garden. It was like at a benefit, and there was like a million people. Elton John and George Michael did, you know, that thing where Elton plays piano and George Michael sang. I mean, so incredible. And then Lionel Richie came out and he did Dancing on the Ceiling and like two other songs, and it was just like you couldn't take your. I was like in the nosebleeds, and you just couldn't take your eyes off Lionel Richie or George Michael or you know. And I remember seeing Run DMC and the Beastie Boys at the Garden, and just being like, "This is incredible!" Like these guys just exude off the stage. They project like right up to you where you're in your seat. And then I saw Tool
Mm,
at the Garden, and it could have been you could have dragged any four guys out of a deli and thrown them up on stage, and it would have been better than the guys in Tool in terms of stage presence. They were non-existent. It was so bizarre.
hmm.
But I remember when I saw the Misfits walk out on stage at Madison Square Garden, halfway through that set, I was like, man, if there was, you know, like I saw the Misfits at Great Gildersleeves on the Bowery. I saw them at Irving Plaza, which was probably their peak, their biggest they ever were. And that place is minuscule. And people don't, you know, because of this whole, you know, Cliff Burton phenomenon where he kind of made the Misfits gave them notoriety after the fact
Yeah.
by proxy, really. That this whole wave of metal fans and just regular people became aware of this kind of like myth of the Misfits, and because Cliff liked them, they must have been great. And they were, but they were small, they were minuscule. I mean, they were so minuscule that it was not even a thing for Glenn to just be like, I'm going to change the name to Sam Hain.
Hmm.
It wasn't like he was like, oh, I have this 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 brand that I have to
Yeah.
protect. This corporation, you know, it was just a local band, and he decided to do something else, and then he forsake that, and he did Danzig, and you know, the Misfits became a footnote until Cliff, but you know, the phenomenon caught up with Cliff's influence, and there were the Misfits sold out at Madison Square Garden. And all I kept thinking was, I don't care how they got there. I don't care about, you know, the influence that Metallica had on it. There was never a band that belonged on stage at Madison Square Garden as much as the Misfits did that night.
Yeah, dude, it was the best. And I was just like, and it was so cool to hear your perspective on it too, as somebody who saw them like whenever they were around originally, because I was just like a little kid, like living in Missouri, you know, like listening to my little Misfits coffin box CD set. And so I never thought that I would see them. I saw the Michael Graves era Misfits in the 90s, but then I got to see the Danzig Misfits at Madison Square Garden, and I don't care if it's the only place I ever see them. Seeing the Misfits at the Garden, mind blowing experience.
You saw
Ugh,
the best Misfit show I ever saw.
amazing. I'll take that as a win. Well,
One one
Parris,
one side note on
yeah,
the Misfits thing is like, you know, and I wish Arthur Googie had been up there
mm,
instead of the Slayer drummer. You know, no disrespect to him, he's just not a misfit.
yeah,
He he went in there and did the best he could, but Arthur Googie could have been up there, should have been up there. And the reason I stress that is a couple of years before, um, one day out of the blue, I get a call from Jerry. And he's like, "Hey, I'm in New York. Meet me at Otto's Shrunken Head." So, like, me and my girlfriend, we go over to Otto's Shrunken Head and we sit down, and there's Jerry in full regalia, you know, like the whole thing.
yeah,
And we sit down and we're having drinks and we're just talking. And he slowly says something like, he's like, "Hey, man, we're going to do this album." And this was before the Aggros. This is when I hadn't played music in years. You know, I was so disconnected. I think I said it on the Hard Lord podcast. You're either on the inside or you're on the outside. And it's funny when you're inside on the inside, you know everybody and you like navigate and you get in everywhere. And when you're on the outside, you're on the outside. And I was on the outside, so I wasn't really rubbing elbows with the likes of the Jerry Onlys of the world at that time. But he called me and we met and he said, "Oh, so we're going to do this album. It's going to be an album of covers." And I said, "Oh, that's cool." And I'd seen his his franchise Misfits a couple of times, and I got a kick out of it, but I didn't feel like it was appropriate. And then and then I didn't feel it was appropriate because what we saw at Madison Square Garden was the one. But he says to me, he goes, "If you were going to do a cover, what would you do?" I was like, "Well, what would I do, or what would the Misfits do?" I said, "I would do I'm Evil, the Elvis Presley song
Hmm.
from King Creole, which I always thought was the coolest fucking song." And like everybody remembers Fat Elvis or this Elvis or that Elvis. I only remember Elvis from King Creole or the Vegas reunion because he was so fucking cool. But I told him, I was like, "I think that song, I'm Evil is great. If you're looking for trouble, you come to the right place. If you're looking for trouble, just look in my face. I'm evil, evil, evil." I mean, what a great song for the Misfits to do.
Yeah.
He goes, "Oh, that's a great one. That's a great one." He goes, "Would you play on it?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah, of course." I mean, I hadn't played, and I'd had been immersed as like a filmmaker 13 hours a day, 5 days a week for the previous 20 years or whatever. Didn't even occur to me to do anything like that. So I thought it was pretty cool. And he goes, "Yes, what we'll do is we'll have you come down and we'll work up that song and we'll practice some other songs and then we'll see we'll see how things go." And I was like, "We'll practice some other cover songs?" He's like, like Misfit songs, just see how it goes." And I was like, "What do you mean, like oh, Misfit songs, like old Misfit songs?" And he was like, "Yeah." I was like, "Why?" And he goes, "Well, just see what happens." And I was like, I, what what are you asking me here?" I was like, "Are you asking me to be in the Misfits?" And he goes, "Oh, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, we'll see how it works out. Like you come down and play and see how you feel." And I was like, "Yeah, I can't do that, Jerry." And he goes, "Why not?" Because like now it's been established that he was actually asking me. And I said, he goes, "Why not?" I said, "Because I'm not a misfit."
Hmm.
I said, "Everybody knows who the Misfits are. I'm not a misfit. It doesn't matter that I'm a Cro-Mag.
Hmm.
It's not going to like grandfather me in or something. I just wouldn't feel right about doing that." It's like, how can I feel right about the fact that Harley is out with a bunch of people I've never met playing my music and making a living off of
Yeah.
it, and I'm supposed to do the same thing? That would make me a hypocrite. And I
Amazing.
also, and it's not even like I made the decision because I didn't want to be a hypocrite. I just am not a hypocrite. So I I told Jerry that, and then we just continued hanging out like as if nothing ever was discussed, and he's never mentioned it again, and I've never mentioned it again. And yeah, that's it.
Amazing. Man,
Funny,
that is so cool.
but
Um,
I did jump up on stage with the Misfits at the Roxy about probably a year or two before the actual reunion happened, and to play one song.
man, that's awesome. What a great story. Um, all right. Well, Paris, I mean, I'm just super grateful to you for your time, for coming on and telling the whole entire story of like your involvement with Cro-Mags and writing these amazing records that everybody has loved over the years. And I wanted to give you the opportunity to come on my podcast because I knew that I would get a clear, fabulous, straight front, middle, and back story about this particular song. So I really appreciate you coming on and telling me the whole story. It means a lot. Seriously.
My pleasure. I mean, like I said, the memory is it's like it's right there. It's locked in for so many different reasons. Pride, first of
Hmm.
all those songs were like an early way of defining myself to myself. Like before if you're a songwriter, before you've written any songs, you don't really know how to define yourself. But once you can like listen back to something that you've written, it changes how you perceive yourself and your own abilities, and it becomes a catalyst to everything else you create after that. So those early songs are important to me, and they're close to me and my identity. And when they were written was, they were like these magic moments where I made these discoveries that I hadn't made before. So the impression is indelible.
Amazing. Well, thanks for coming on Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda and telling me the story of hard times. Parris Mayhew, been a real pleasure.
Absolutely, Greg. Thank you.